Trust in the Lord with all thy heart. Lean not to thine own understanding. In all of thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy path. This is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. I'm glad to be in the land of the dying, headed for the land of the living. The Lord has a word for you today. I want to call your attention to the Old Testament prose of Psalm 11. Psalm 11, and I want to focus our sermonic spotlight today on verse number 3 of Psalm 11. I want to encourage you this week to read Psalm 11 in its entirety. It constitutes the context from which I shall preach, but due to the length of the psalm and the limitations on our time, I just want to look at the question that David poses in verse 3. Psalm 11, verse 3, David asks this question: when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? When I was a kid, I loved to read comic books about superheroes. I liked all of them, but I especially liked Bruce Wayne, Batman. That was my favorite. In case you've forgotten, Batman is the story of a man who became a vigilante because his parents got killed coming out of a movie theater. Superman is the story about a guy whose father came from another place down to earth because his hometown of Krypton had been destroyed. Spider-Man is the story about a little boy who went into a lab and got bitten by a rare spider, but the unfortunate bite gave him supernatural strength. The Fantastic Four is a story about 4 kids who went through a cosmic storm in space and then came back to Earth with power that they would not have had they not gone through a storm. I'm just trying to tell you that heroes are birthed out of tragedies, that every time one of us goes through something, we gain a power that we would not have had we not gone through. I want to remind you that as a nation, but more specifically as a race, we have gone through affliction, but it has given us some power, some resiliency, some ingenuity that we would not have had we not gone through. As a matter of fact, as we look over our shoulders and reminisce about how we made it to where we are right now, our testimony is that we have come from a mighty long way. We look back to review where we've come from and to remember how we got here. We revisit the perilous paths over which we have passed, the rough spots that we have run into, the trying times that we lived through that almost crushed our spirits and changed our trajectory. But we are here today to celebrate the way over which we've come. We're here to celebrate the victories we have won, the work that has been done, the sacrifices that have been made, the effort that have been expended. We celebrate the critics who deepened our resolve, the supporters who came alongside to encourage us, now we're able to testify that what we've been through as a people has forged within us a resilient hope and a dynamic promise that our destiny is greater than our history, that what is within us is greater than any of the problems that are around us. And that is the dream of those that precede us. This is the hope of those who support us. This is the fear of those who want to dominate, oppress, control, and destroy us. But it is out of this crucible of that critical context that we call our past, that we now stand on the shoulders of our foreparents and remember the way over which we've come. But as we remember what has been, we also must look closely at what is, how we live in an hour of international challenge, international stress, and economic schizophrenia. We have an epidemic of incarceration, a healthcare dilemma, a failing public education system, skyrocketing dropout rates, AIDS and COVID-19 pandemic, police brutality. We have to fight injustice in our institutions and in the systems that enslaved our ancestors and continue even to this very day to menace our nation. We cannot escape it, The racism that that embroiled our ancestors is still causing us to have a struggle for survival. Its effects are still resounding and reverberating even to this very day. And so as we accurately and honestly assess what is, the question is, how have we made it thus far? For hundreds of years and with no voice, no vote, or no veto, yet despite it all and through it all, we've had our first African-American president. We have leaders in business and industry and inventors. How have we made it this far? How did we survive the horrors of slavery? And then after the abolition of slavery, there was 12 years of Reconstruction and 73 years of Jim Crow segregation and its black codes and the birth and the rise of a new Jim Crow. How have we survived? How have our foreparents been able to bring about the abolition of slavery? How were they able to survive and thrive during Reconstruction? How were they able to bring an end to the era of Jim Crow segregation? How did they do it? Amid lawlessness and amid overwhelming political oppression and underwhelming social capital, how did they do it? Because while we celebrate how far we've come and what we have survived, and as we assess where we are right now, the psalmist asks a very poignant and potent question in Psalm 11. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? We don't have to look far to conclude that there is an effort afoot to destroy the foundations. So what are the righteous to do when the foundations are being destroyed? What are the righteous to do when systems of injustice rule the land and the structures of oppression cripple our progress? This is not a new question, but an age-old question. And our nation, but more specifically people of color, have answered this question in no uncertain terms. We have lived out the ethics of this question, and they are lessons that we should not easily or soon forget. And they are legacies from which we should not divorce ourselves, especially in this day and age. We need to re-examine the foundation upon which we stand and assert the legacy of our ancestors. What are the righteous to do when the foundations are being destroyed? Let me add here that life will pose threats and will present difficulties. And in fact, we should not be surprised that life has forces that rally against us. In fact, we ought to be surprised when life is not railing against us. But the foundation upon which we stand, our history involves speaking truth to power and fighting back and not giving up. This is the witness that we have, and Psalm 11 testifies through the hallways of history that culture is not safe in the hands of the godless. History testifies that progress is prohibited under the hands of the unrighteous. What are the righteous to do? I say again, we have lived out the ethics of Psalm 11. This text urges us to testify that our only hope has been and will be the God who delivers his people from ungodly rule. Our only chance for success in a godless society is in the power of God to deliver his people. And as we look back at our history, we discover that the more we depended upon God, the more dependable we found out God was. If you try God and trust God like our foreparents did, you will discover that God is stronger than your hurt and mightier than you realize. So what can the righteous do? Well, they can forge within them a faith that forces us to fight. That instead of running away when things get difficult, we stand and fight. In verse 1 of Psalm 11, the psalmist says, "In the Lord I take refuge." So how can you say to me, "Flee like a bird to your mountains"? This is a word about resiliency in the face of earthly uncertainty. It expresses a defiant confidence in God, that though the wicked do come to power, I ultimately have nothing to worry about because it's in the Lord that I take refuge. Zora Neale Hurston wrote a tremendous book entitled "Their Eyes Were Watching God." And my sisters and my brothers, our eyes ought to be watching God as well. Do not run in the midst of godlessness, but keep your eyes fastened on the Lord. The psalmist says, "In the Lord I take refuge." We get the sense that the psalmist feels impending danger approaching. from which he needed protection, because one does not need refuge unless danger is coming. And so he makes a conscious effort to take shelter and to find cover against the threats and the dangers that were on their way. My sisters and my brothers, life will pose threats and difficulties. We should not be surprised, yet the person who trusts in God need not resign themselves to despair. They need not run away, because we have a place and a person of refuge. The psalmist says it's in the Lord. He says, in the Lord I take refuge. At that time, mountain crags often protected animals who sought physical protection in times of approaching calamity. And so we likewise find refuge as we trust in the Lord. Mountain crags were used as refuge because it was difficult for the animals to get to them when they hid in the mountain crags. So when tragedy threatens us and when enemies swirl around us, when we too should find refuge in God. In times of danger, we have a natural instinct to run for cover. And the question is not if you're going to run but for cover, but where are you going to run, and to whom are you going to run to? The text argues that for believers, there is not but one viable option, and it is to trust in the Lord, to run to the Lord, to cling to the Lord. Here he uses a more specific term. He uses the term Yahweh. It's a verb in the Hebrew language. It's stuck in the present tense, that God reveals his name in the present tense. Not that God was, not that he will be, but that he is right now. That's the kind of God I need. Not one who was great or will be great, but I need a right now God, a God who is omnipresent, that God is everywhere at the same time. God is leaving where God is going. He's always in the right now, and it's in that God that I take refuge. I want to suggest that is the witness of black people in this country, that we've not had the luxury of taking refuge in Washington, D.C. We've not had the luxury of taking refuge on Wall Street. We've not had the luxury of taking refuge in great universities. We've had but one refuge, and that was to run to the house of the Lord, to run to the one who has a name which is above every name. And we found out that when we run to the Lord, that he is. This is the witness that we have. Our history reminds us that the only refuge, protection, and cover we have is Almighty God. When we were children, my sister used to lead a song in the junior choir that asked, where do I go when there's nobody else to turn to? And who do I talk to when nobody wants to listen? Who do I lean on when there's no foundation stable? I go to the rock. I know that he's able. I go to the rock. My brothers and my sisters, God is our refuge. And we need to recover the faith that we have had and look at what has brought us and who has brought us safe thus far. God is our refuge. I raise this today because in this generation we are suffering from amnesia. We have forgotten who it was that brought us out and who brought us through. We think we don't need God anymore because we're now able to wear Gucci and Prada, and we are members in fraternities and sororities. We are marching with our fists up in the air. But we should never forget that even though there are those who deride the church as irrelevant, as if the church didn't invent marching as a means of protest, as if ministers didn't come up with a strategy of litigation in court, as if the church did not provide cover and refuge for us to lobby for freedom we now enjoy. I want to urge you to reclaim your roots, because if the church was good enough for Paul and Silas, if the church was good enough for Martin Luther and John Calvin, if the church was good enough for Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Ida B. Wells and Martin King, then it's good enough for you and I as well. The legacy of the black churches is not just one of piety and praise, but our faith that brings you over and brings you out and brings you through, a faith that sustains you when the government does not acknowledge you as fully human. It's in the Lord that I take refuge. Those who have fled to God don't have to flee from the ungodly or the unrighteous. Others are saying to the psalmist to flee like a bird to your mountain, but it's as if the psalmist says to them, you don't have to flee if you've already fled to the Lord. Those who were saying to David, go to the mountains, they meant well, but David responds, what do I need to go to the mountain for when I'm already in God? What good is a mountain when you got the one who made the mountains? Mountains are high, lofty plains which keep birds away from the dangers of the ravenous wolves below. They fly up to the mountains to sit between the crags of rocks and feel safe. But David is saying, even if you could take the wings of birds and fly up into the mountains, it would still fall short of the protection and the refuge that you have in the Lord right now. That's the tension. He intones, secondly, in the second verse, that the wicked have their weapons set. Their bows and their arrows are already on the string, ready to shoot, but they are shooting in darkness. The Bible makes no promise that you and I will not lose our treasures. We may lose our valuables, but we will never lose our value. Our faith in God, the protection of our soul, our help comes from the Lord, and he will not suffer our foot to be moved. And I know much of today's preaching makes the material things that we possess the object of our faith. But the psalmist is saying that what is most important about us is invisible and intangible, that God protects us. If the foundations are destroyed, what shall the righteous do? Peter, you will be afflicted, but don't worry about that, because I have prayed for you that your faith will not be destroyed. If the foundations are destroyed, if is an insufficient reason to panic. If the foundations are destroyed, the word for foundation describes the moral values. If the foundations are destroyed, they are at risk for destruction. But what are the righteous to do if the wicked get in charge and they destroy the very moral fabric that makes society valuable? What are we to do if they undo the foundations of a just society? In the text, the wicked were attacking the upright. The unjust were attacking the innocent. And that is the plight of every culture at every time in history. The wicked threaten to undo the very foundations of a just society. I need not remind you that in our day there is wickedness as well. A cradle to prison pipeline, wickedness. Unjustified killing of unarmed African Americans by law enforcement, wickedness. Underfunding of schools, wickedness. And what are the righteous to do in the face of that kind of wickedness? I'll tell you what our people have done. They went to church and pooled their resources. Churches looked at crumbling foundation and decided that they would educate their own people. They started schools like Wilberforce. We clung to the gospel of Jesus Christ. We didn't buy into the notion that Christianity was a white man's religion. But we kept on looking back into the history and saw that even Jesus spent his first 2 years in North Africa. We didn't buy into that false narrative that we discovered God when we got here. But we know that we came to these colonies as believers already. And we believe, not because our faith has its roots in Africa, but we ought to say it anyway. But we believe that our faith was given to us by God himself. That even our slave preachers learned to insist that there was much more to the scripture than slaves obey your masters. We kept our eyes watching God. What do you do when the foundations are being destroyed? Don't run, but stand up and fight. Let your faith cause you to fight. But it's not just that our eyes are watching God. But here's the greater shout, that God's eyes are watching us. Look at verse 4. He says, the Lord is in his holy temple. And the one who loves violence, his soul hates. On the one hand, we keep our eyes on the refuge that is our God. But on the other hand, the Lord has his eyes on us. In our human extremities, we discover God's all-sufficiency. We discover the faithfulness of the protection of God. We discover that his eyes are watching us from his holy temple, his throne which is in heaven. The text says that God is somewhere that we cannot get to right now. He's in heaven. He has not left where he is. He's still in his holy temple. God is in heaven. We are here on earth. And we need to learn to live life with the right perspective. Don't confuse down here with up there. That just because things look a certain way down here does not mean that that's how they look from up there. We have sickness and sorrow, mean, cutthroat, ungodly people down here. But it does not mean that our faith is stuck down here. I'm looking forward to a land up there. Down here, we will have some more troubles, trials. We will have some more being ridiculed. But our faith is bigger than down here. Our faith is also up there. And up there, the wicked cease from troubling. Down here is the land of some more. But we are on our way to the land of no more. No more sickness and no more sorrow. And this is the language of the text. It says to us that God's eyes are watching us. He uses this poetic language to suggest, and we know that God does not have eyes, but it is to suggest that God's eyes never close. It's a word of encouragement that God is watching us. Not going the way you want them to, but God is still watching us. God has a watching ministry. God was watching Pharaoh when labor negotiations broke down. God was watching the framers of the Constitution. God was watching Bull Connor. God is watching the fellow that's in the White House right now. And God is going to bring an end to unrighteousness. The same God who is watching them is empowering us. So stand and take a risk for God. God will be vindicated. God will be seen as the righteous God. Don't believe me? Ask Thurgood Marshall. God will be vindicated. Don't believe me? Ask Martin Luther King. One day he said, I see a nation where our kids will live out the true content of their kids. Don't believe me? Keep on trusting in God. 2008 asked that black man who stood and became the president of these yet to be United States of America. I don't need black history to tell you that God will be vindicated. On a hill called Calvary, with the spear in his side, a crown of thorns on his head, he died until death died, and died until sin apologized. Thanks be unto God. God will be vindicated. God bless you and God keep you is our prayer.